The waxy crude oil is distributed beneath a place called the Uintah Basin, a 7,000 square mile section of northeastern Utah, a landscape pockmarked by the machinery of oil, a place isolated by distance, geography, and terrain from large population centers. The Uintah Basin, an area nearly the size of the state of New Jersey, sits atop a significant volume of crude oil that historically resisted collection until modern drilling techniques and a procedure called fracking changed the calculus. The railroad idea has been decades in the making, but has only recently acquired support from politicians and agencies and has cleared many of the first bureaucratic hurdles. This is happening at a time when the people of the earth and many governments are awakening to the dangers of carbon-based energies. Oil producers of the Uintah Basin have revived an old scheme which will make it possible to frack and pump more oil out of the earth and ship it into the environment, over 10 million barrels a year. In recent history, oil production amounts have been limited by transportation. The only way to currently get the crude out of the Uintah Basin is by tanker truck, traveling over two-lane roads. The trucks sometimes don't get to where they're going. A railroad into the Uintah Basin isn't a new idea. More than 100 years ago, a narrow gauge system wound a tortured route from the border town of Mack, Colorado, over nearby Baxter Pass, then on 75 miles to Watson, Utah. Gilsonite, a solid form of crude, was the thing of value in those days. The unusual articulated steam engines dragged the stuff back to be refined and used in a variety of ways, from printer's ink to caulking for wooden beer barrels. But the old dream has been updated. An ambitious and very expensive plan called the Uintah Basin Railroad, conceived this time by members of a Utah 7-county coalition.
We have oil, it's estimated that the easy oil is over 3 billion barrels is in the ground, in the basin. And we have the oil, we have the ag, but without the oil, we really have no driver to our economy.
Organizers imagined railroad tracks that travel south from the basin through untamed canyons and a national forest. They dream about locomotives pulling long trains of oil tankers through tunnels and up over 9,000-foot mountains.
Trucking is much more expensive than railroads. Truck hauls, on average, one railroad car of freight is equivalent to 4 truckloads. A train, so if a train is 100 cars long, that's 400 truckloads of freight on one train. And so it provides a huge cost advantage for people who want to use the railroad.
80 to 100 of those difficult miles later, the proposed railroad would join the mainline tracks of the Union Pacific in Bryce Canyon, Utah. The coalition received permission from the Federal Surface Transportation Board to begin the process.
We have to do something, and this is a viable product, a project that we can do that will hopefully fix our economy here in the basin, stabilize it for the generations to come. Everything's a gamble. This is very doable. You look at the economics of it, the feasibility of it, and what we've done the last year and a half, I feel like I'm very confident that it's doable.
The Uintah Basin promoters seek up to $3 billion in a tax-exempt private activity government bond. The promoters created an environmental impact statement, a document which assesses the potential damage the railroad would cause to the forests and canyons, the rivers and creeks it will encounter along its route.
And this railroad idea was to get the oil to the East Coast and have another market and expand our production.
The Surface Transportation Board approved the Uintah Basin application, even though the environmental impact statement was only a draft. Not all members of the Transportation Board agreed. The chairman dedicated 11 pages of dissent to the idea that all the environmental issues weren't addressed and financial investment partners are not up to snuff. Importantly, the environmental impact statement covers the terrain traveled until the Uintah Basin rails reach the Union Pacific mainline. There appears to have been little thought given to what will occur when trains, maybe 8,000 feet long, maybe 5 trains eastbound and loaded, and 5 empty trains heading west each day. What might happen as they rumble through pristine canyons, the cities, the tunnels, on the journey alongside the Southwest's most important river, the Colorado. In July 2023, the Union Pacific Chief of Safety tells a Colorado Legislative Committee that his railroad hasn't performed an analysis of the impact the additional traffic will have on the mainline tracks. What could go wrong? We'll start with possibly the worst event we could find. In Quebec, Canada, a little more than a decade ago. The engineer thought he set the brakes on an oil tanker train when he left it unattended on a slight downgrade almost 7 miles from the town of Lac-Mégantic. As is often the case, a chain of unintended events followed. The oil cars began to coast down the tracks after midnight, slowly at first, unlighted and ghostly quiet. The 4,700-foot-long train gained speed. 72 tankers filled with crude oil from the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota, and no human supervision. At the western edge of Lac-Mégantic, 10,000 tons of oil and steel raced, couplers clanking, wheels screeching at 65 miles per hour, heading toward the 10-mile-per-hour curve at the center of town.
Oh là là, je vais m'éloigner là. Tout est en train de péter un par un.
The language of fear and terror needs no translation.
Oui, t'inquiète pas pour moi, ok? Oh mon Dieu! Oh mon Dieu! Oh my God!
5 victims were never found. It took over a year to identify all the 42 bodies that were recovered amid the 115 businesses and buildings that were destroyed or damaged in the fires and explosions. Bankruptcies and insurance claims of over $50 million followed. The Canadian government changed some rules. Lac-Mégantic is still recovering. Recently, opponents have circled the wagons and voiced loud political and legal objections to the Uintah Basin Railroad. They have awakened to the prospect that transporting vast amounts of waxy crude along an iconic river through the lofty landscapes and chiseled canyons of western Colorado is, well, a pretty dumb idea.
The oil trains from Uintah Basin are not welcome in Colorado.
The Union Pacific mainline tracks move through Carbon County, Utah, in the morning shadows of the Book Cliffs, a very long stretch of low, distinctive mountains from Helper, Utah, to Grand Junction, Colorado. The trains pick up long lines of tankers full of waxy crude at the Price River Terminal in Wellington, Utah. The terminal is the offload location for the trucks that bring the crude from the Uintah Basin. Here, the crude is transferred from highway transport to rail. A majority of the current output is shipped west by rail to refineries in Salt Lake City, refineries that have the technical ability to handle the waxy nature of the Uintah Basin crude. There are a few other U.S. refineries up to the technical task. It is those facilities in Louisiana and Texas that are the target. It is expected that 5 times the Uintah Basin waxy crude output will be heading east if the proposed railroad is built. This oil train idles on a siding in Cisco, a ramshackle outpost in Utah where the ghosts of uranium miners dwell alongside a small but hardy citizenry who recall the day that Thelma and Louise came to town to film an explosive movie scene. This oil train is over a mile long. Each 140-ton heated tanker car holds 650 barrels of waxy crude. Roughly 52,000 barrels of crude are waiting for the mainline to clear before rolling into Ruby Horse Thief Canyon and on into Colorado. Here, the Union Pacific tracks begin to parallel the path of the Colorado River. The river carves the path of least resistance through the mountains. It roars and flows and wears a route between here and there. Rivers led the way for the development of the American West. The tracks follow the river to the headwaters, more than 250 miles upward, toward the exposed spine of the country, the Rocky Mountains. The eastbound trains follow the westbound river because the natural incline is more favorable. The uphill grades are within the weight and power tolerance levels of the diesel locomotives. But the latest oil tank cars are very heavy. Investigators believe bolts that hold rails together sheared from the weight, and this was the result: derailment and fire in the Columbia River Gorge in Washington state.
The derailment is, a couple hundred feet at most from the Columbia River. In the Columbia River Gorge, it's very constrained. We have high cliffs and the river and the highway and the railroad, and in some places the railroad is hanging over the river. It's still burning, it's still smoking, and we're not sure about any releases of oil at this point.
The original steam locomotives required the reliable source of water the rivers could provide. Towns grew up next to the tracks. Some towns became major cities, sustained by products that were delivered largely by rail. The romantic notion of taming the wilderness is memorialized in movies, a notion shared by Italian spaghetti western movie director Sergio Leone, although this scene was actually shot in Spain. Modern oil trains travel the main line often. Miles of evidence of the activity sit idle on sidings in places like Grand Junction, a western Colorado city established as a rail center. The tankers await assignment to pick up and deliver more crude. The Uintah Basin Railway plans will significantly increase traffic. 10 long crude trains each day will often compete for mainline right-of-way with the California Zephyr, Amtrak's Chicago to San Francisco passenger streamliner. The Zephyr arrives on time only about 30% of the time. Some delays caused by weather, crew scheduling, or maintenance seem tolerable, but the Zephyr regularly stops and waits for freight traffic to clear the way ahead. 50 years ago, the government announced that passenger trains in America would have the right-of-way. The rule has largely been ignored. Sometimes the Zephyr reaches its destination up to 12 hours late. The scheduled and much anticipated scenic Amtrak travel through the Rockies is often experienced by passengers in total darkness. Opponents of the crude oil train say it will be only a matter of time before something disastrous will happen. They say not if it would happen, but when and where. The drought-threatened and over-allocated Colorado River supplies the Southwest with water for fertile farmland, for recreation, for hydroelectric power, and for water for people to drink and cook and bathe with in Los Angeles, Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Denver, and almost all the places in between. 3 Mexican states and Native Americans depend on the river. Most people agree we shouldn't mess with the Colorado River. Everything possible should be done to protect this vital resource. The Union Pacific mainline route passes through cities and towns, large, medium, and small. The nature of nearly all the communities has changed over time. The Grand Valley of western Colorado, with its long rail history, has evolved into an education, medical, and retirement center. In the eastern part of the valley grow peaches and apricot orchards and vast vineyards where world-famous wines are produced. The railroad and the river both pass through. Farther east, Parachute, Battlement Mesa, and Rifle are communities where agriculture and the natural gas industry provide a foundation for growth and well-being. The town of Silt is east of Rifle. Silt is the hometown of Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, who has remained uncharacteristically speechless with regard to the Uintah Basin Railroad, even though the trains pass 1 block south of the main drag. In fairness to the Congresswoman, sometimes events can truly leave you speechless.
And it shot up a mushroom cloud about as high as those plume is now, like that.
Continue this in a second. Did you get a picture of that? Man, that's hot.
The leaders down the tracks in Glenwood Springs are far more vocal. They sense the threat. State officials joined city council members to proclaim their opposition to the plan.
This canyon is a very fragile place. We've had the Grizzly Creek fire. We've had climate change induced floods, rock slide.
Glenwood Springs rests tight between the mountains. One valley breaks south along the Roaring Fork River toward Aspen and Snowmass and some of the state's famous ski resorts. Roaring Fork is a tributary, adding more water to the Colorado River volume. Glenwood Springs is intimate, with renowned hot springs, pools, and gracious hotels that sit on the opposite side of the river from where an antique train station welcomes visitors. The oil trains will continue east into Glenwood Canyon, the primary travel route jammed into 12 glorious miles of wounded geology, 2,000-foot cliffs on each side, and the final constructed sections of the original Interstate 70. East and west highway lanes often overlap to allow room for the river to squeeze between the highway and the trains. Major wildfires in recent years have left portions of the canyon cliffs without forest and vegetation to hold the soil. Mud and rock slides have closed the canyon for both rail and highway travel. A mainline railroad, a major highway, and a river in tight, unstable geology. What could go wrong? There is irony. Climate change-related weather events that bring the extreme heat, the dryness, and the fires. Carbon-based fuels are to blame. And now the Uintah Basin plans to massively increase the barrels of crude. Somehow the discussion seems fundamentally incoherent. The river and the railroad turn northward after leaving Glenwood Canyon and away from the I-70 corridor. The area is not as populated, but the geography is still wild and craggy. Eventually, the tracks reach rural cities in northwestern Colorado, still following the river to where it begins, barely on the west side of the Continental Divide, near Estes Park and Rocky Mountain National Park. These craggy peaks, a number of them over 14,000 feet tall, are the geologic border called the Front Range, well known to Native Americans. They're the first visual representation of the Rocky Mountains, encountered 200 years ago by Western explorers. From where the rails entered western Colorado to here, the trains have climbed 5,000 feet. They will pass under the Continental Divide through Moffett Tunnel, built a century ago to make rail travel from Denver to Salt Lake easier, safer, faster, and more profitable. The tunnel is just over 6 miles long. Each day, 15 trains traveling in alternate direction pass through the tunnel. Once a train clears the tunnel, huge fans suck the bad air out. The process takes about 20 minutes before the next train can pass safely. This cycle creates a maximum daily capacity of about 25 trains through the tunnel. Union Pacific leases the Moffett from the state of Colorado. The annual rent is $12,000. That's less than what a studio apartment leases for in Denver. The railroad's 99-year deal ends in less than 2 years. Crude oil train opponents view tunnel lease negotiations as another leverage point in the Uintah Basin railway debate. The east portal of the Moffett Tunnel is almost 5,000 feet above street level in Denver. Trains are forced to negotiate a twisty route up and down the foothills, east and west. There are curves where the engineer might be able to see the end of his own train. The tail may appear to be ahead of him as it snakes carefully through the turns that ease the dramatic descent into Denver, where sometimes the mechanical devices don't work the way they should and the oil train cars flip over. And we haven't even mentioned East Palestine, Ohio. Well, that's the idea. The Uintah Basin is a remote area, little more than a distant thought to most Americans. But waxy crude there is abundant. New drilling methods bring the promise of greater wealth. But oil production is limited by the geography. Oil men need a more efficient method to move their crude to market. They and others believe a $3 billion public-funded 88-mile-long railroad is the answer. All this comes at a time when a great deal of the civilized world has determined the planet is being destroyed by fossil fuels. This also comes at a time when we've grown to appreciate and love all the things that lie along the path the trains will take.